are angels?
What are angels? Boy, could this be a complicated question, but I'm going to try to err on the side of simplicity. Angels are members of God's heavenly host, and the term itself, both in Hebrew, which is malach, and Greek, angelos, means messenger. And so that sort of telegraphs what an angel is, but also what an angel does.
Do angels have wings?
This is actually a really common question, and my answer to that is no. Angels do not have wings, and typically when I'm speaking somewhere, this is at the point where I start looking for exits, because people just grow up with this notion. And you have to ask, well, why would you say no, and where does the notion come from, if the answer is no? If you actually look in the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, when you encounter angels, when people encounter angels, they never have wings. They look just like human beings do. They are indistinguishable from humans, at least in the Old Testament. There are a couple of exceptions to this in the New Testament where they're sort of glowing and shiny and luminous. But other than those instances, and by the way, that's at the birth of the Messiah and at the resurrection tomb is where you get those exceptions. But everywhere else, they're just like people. You wouldn't know that they were any different than a normal person. So that's why angels don't have wings. There isn't a single passage that actually says that. Now, some people would say, well, I've read in the Bible about angels ascending and descending. Right, that's true. Those passages do exist, but none of them say that they have wings. They're not flying. In fact, the same language of descending that is used of angels, say like in Revelation 10, is used of Jesus at his return. And trust me, Jesus did not grow a pair of wings to come back at the second coming. It's just the language of coming from heaven and going to heaven. But they're never said to have wings. So why do people think this? Well, they think it because they'll take passages like Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 1, where we have seraphim and cherubim mentioned respectively, and they do have wings. And people assume that seraphim and cherubim are angels, but they're not. They're never called angels. Those terms are actually terms that are used in the ancient world for guardians of the king. In terms of the Bible, in terms of God's throne room, they would be guardians of sacred presence. God doesn't need protection. He doesn't need bodyguards or anything like that. Like he's not scared or anything like that. But the idea is that cherubim and seraphim protect sacred space, protect God's presence from what? From defilement. This is why in Isaiah 6, the prophet has to be cleansed with a hot coal from the tongs there with the fire. That's what their job is. So cherubim and seraphim are job descriptions. Angel is, in fact, just a job description, a messenger. Different jobs, different entities, they're not the same thing. But we sort of grow up being taught or thinking that they are. All right, hold on. Before we get to the next question, I'm sure there are going to be people out there in the audience that say something like, what's seraphim and cherubim? Like, I've never heard those terms before. What in the world is he talking about? Well, again, these are characters. They're figures that in some scenes in the Bible, when a prophet is sort of taken to the throne room of God, he sees these creaturely beings occupying sacred space in God's throne room. The terminology actually was familiar to ancient people in association with kings, because there are actual examples in archaeology when you have a throne that the king sits on. The throne gets decorated all around with these odd figures. Let's talk about the seraphim first. They have 6 wings. Okay, they, are supposedly fiery beings, because most scholars would say seraphim comes from seraph, which means to burn, like fiery, again, luminous sort of beings. There's actually another way to understand that term, and seraph can mean serpentine or reptilian or something like that. The terminology actually comes from ancient Egypt, and in the book of Isaiah, where you get this scene in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah's reign had a lot of overlaps with ancient Egypt. They were allies. And so archaeologists have discovered things like Hezekiah's royal seal that has the Egyptian scarab beetle on it with wings. So there were lots of Egyptian images that are associated with Hezekiah's reign, and the Seraphim are one of these. What these are, if you go to Egyptian art and the way they're depicted there, they are supernatural beings that take on the appearance of an Egyptian cobra, for instance. Again, guardians of sacred space. We have to protect, either in Egypt, the deceased or the king or the pharaoh or something from all evil, from defilement or something like that. That imagery actually gets used in Isaiah 6. And that isn't typically the way you would hear seraphim talked about, but if you put that passage in its context, that's where the imagery comes from. You know, they're supernatural beings, and they're described a certain way to readers so that readers will know why they're there. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we went to heaven today, you know, there are actually creatures running around there. Okay, these are supernatural beings, members of the heavenly host, and so that you know what their job is, Isaiah describes them a certain way. They appear in a certain form, so that Isaiah would look at them and say, "Okay, I'm not going any further. Okay, these are the guardians of God's presence. I know why they're there." It's the same thing for cherubim, except that term comes from Babylonian. And again, we have thrones from the biblical period. And in Ezekiel chapter 1, this is actually what you have described. You have animals that are sort of like cattle, but they have wings and 4 faces. This is what a cherub, a cherubim, the set of cherubim would be in the ancient world. Cherubim are the way a Babylonian would draw or talk about or describe the guardian of the king. Guardians of sacred space. If you went into a throne room in ancient Babylon, you would see statues of these. You would see the throne decorated this way. Because, you know, think of the security guard, think of the bouncer. These are big, bad, tough, and otherworldly things. The king in the ancient world was viewed as being put in his position by the gods, being partly divine anyway. And so you get a mix of supernatural and natural powers and abilities. Same thing in Egypt with the cobra, how fearsome that was. This is how these beings are described. So a cherubim, a set of cherubim, that's a plural, and seraphim in the biblical world, when these appear in scenes, and there aren't many of them, but they're always associated with the presence of God to warn people, either the reader, to remind the reader, or to warn the prophet or whoever happens to be treading on sacred space at the moment, that you can only come so close. Okay, don't overstep the boundaries, because there's a difference between the space that God occupies and where you're allowed to stand. So it teaches an important theological lesson.
What are the purpose of angels?
Okay, now that we're done with that, let's go back to angels, the simpler question. What do angels do? What's their purpose? Well, one of them we've already sort of touched on, and that is to take messages to people. Now, yeah, sure, God could just, audibly give someone a message or show up in a dream. I mean, all these things happen in the pages of the Bible. But sometimes God will send one of his agents, an angel, a messenger, to a person to give them a message. And other times, an angel will show up not really to give a message, but to explain either an earlier message or to explain what's going on in that person's life. The person wonders, why is this happening to me? You actually get instances of angels showing up and saying, okay, let me help you process this. Here's what God is up to. Angels also have other purposes. Some of them we don't like to think about, but angels are also instruments of judgment. Sometimes when God decides that it's time for an evil person to be punished or an evil nation to be punished, he will send an angel or a group of angels to do that. Now, we're familiar with the story of Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt, and the plagues and all that sort of thing, where, maybe in the last plague we have the death of the firstborn. If you've seen Prince of Egypt, you sort of know what this is about. And there's this character. In Hebrew, it's the mashkit, the destroyer, the destroying angel in other passages. And you think, okay, in that last plague, there was some kind of death angel, and God punishes Egypt with the death of the firstborn, so on and so forth. Well, all that's true. But there are passages in the Psalms that actually link angels with some of the other plagues. And we don't really read about that in Exodus. You don't see that in the movies, but it's there in some of the Psalms describing what happened with the plagues at the Exodus. So angels can do that too. Sometimes, I think this is one of the more interesting ones, we get mentioned in Scripture, in the Bible, about the book of life. If your name is written in the book of life, that means you're going to have everlasting life, you're going to be in heaven, so on and so forth. And again, that's true. There are such references, but there are actually about a half a dozen different heavenly books. And the keepers of those books and the keepers of those records are, believe it or not, the holy ones, members of the heavenly host. And this is stuff you just won't hear in church. Okay, you get it in the book of Job several times. You get it in other passages. You say, well, what does God need? Why does he need a bunch of scribes, in the heavens? Does God have a bad memory? Does he have some sort of, mental defect? I thought he was omniscient. Why does he need this? The point of the idea, the point of the metaphor, is not that God has memory problems. The point is that God sees everything. He knows everything. Nothing that happens to you, good or bad, is overlooked. So Scripture will often use this idea that God is watching. There's a phrase, the eyes of the Lord running to and fro through the whole earth in Zechariah. Turns out those are angels. God uses members of his supernatural family to participate with him in doing things he wants to get done. And God doesn't need you, believer, or the church either. God uses the beings that he creates to be like him, to be his representatives, to do certain tasks. Sure, God could do everything if he wanted to, but he doesn't. God likes to have his kids participate with him to do things that he wants to get done. And this is one of those things. But again, you never hear about this really in church, heavenly books, angels, keeping track of what's going on. But they do that. They do that. Hebrews chapter 1 is more general. It talks about angels being sent to minister to believers. They're ministering spirits to help believers out. There's actually a whole bunch of things that angels do. But that's sort of, covers the gist of the territory.